Hello, welcome to this OFS webinar on how we are proposing to regulate harassment and sexual misconduct in a new way. My name's Emma Douthwaite. I'm the Safeguarding and Welfare Manager at the Office for Students. I will be hosting the webinar today, but it's not my screen that we're sharing. So we are going to do a very COVID-related, next slide please, approach. So if I could ask Dawn, next slide, please. Thank you. So a few event notices to start. We've turned on the live transcription feature in Zoom. So captions are available by clicking on the CC icon. The captions are automatically generated, so there may be some errors in what is displayed on screen. The event is being recorded and will be made available on our website after the event has concluded. We will paste the web link to where that will be in the chat box. Please submit your questions for us at any time during the event using the Q&A box in Zoom and not the chat box. Where possible, and if you feel comfortable, please include your name and the name of your university or college or organisation, or noting also that you're a student as well. We're interested to hear your questions, and depending on the number of questions that we receive, we may not need the full 90 minutes we've set aside for today, so you may get a few minutes of your time back. And if you would like to speak with our events team, or if you have any technical issues, they can be contacted via the chat box. Next slide, please. So I will introduce the team and go over the consultation timelines. Our team will then give you some background and take you through some key aspects of what we are proposing. As we only have an hour and a half together today, and because we wanted to give enough time for question and answer session, we won't be discussing everything in the consultation in detail, but we have selected some key areas to discuss with you. So first, we will look at proposals A and B. We will then have a Q&A session on what we've covered so far. Questions on the later proposals will be answered in the second Q&A section. After the first Q&A session, we will discuss proposals D and F, and then we'll have a Q&A session on proposals D and F as well. Harassment and sexual misconduct are difficult topics, so please take care of yourselves and step away if you need to. We are also putting a link in the chat to some places where you can get help and support if you need to. Okay, next slide, please. Let's get started. So this next slide will introduce you to the team that we have today. Yeah, brilliant. You'll see me, Misha, Amy and Gemma. Misha Patel is a member of our OFS student panel. Amy Norton is our Head of Equality, Diversity and Inclusion. And Gemma Toombs is a Senior Risk Manager, Compliance and Student Protection. So Misha will share her perspective as a student leader, and Amy and Gemma will give an overview of key aspects of our proposals and will be answering your questions during the Q&A sessions. So I will start by giving a bit of background on who is the OFS. Next slide, please. So the Office for Students is the regulator for higher education in England. We aim to ensure that every student, whatever their background, has a fulfilling experience of higher education that enriches their lives and careers. This includes prospective and current students who are undergraduates or postgraduates, UK-based or international, students studying full-time or part-time, and those based on campus or learning at a distance. And what is a regulator? So simply put, a regulator is a body that oversees a particular sector or industry. So for higher education in England, the regulator is the Office for Students. But other UK regulators you may be familiar with are Ofgem, which regulates gas and electricity suppliers, Ofcom, which regulates television, streaming services and broadband, and Ofsted, which regulates schools and sixth form colleges. So as a regulator, the OFS doesn't have a direct role in dealing with individual disputes between students and universities and colleges. If a student has a complaint, they should first go through their university or college's complaint system. But if they would like to, they can then raise it with the Office for the Independent Adjudicator for Higher Education, which is also known as the OIA. But if a student tells us that they think their university or college might not be meeting one of our regulatory requirements, we can use that information as part of monitoring compliance with our requirements. Next slide, please. So we regulate over 400 universities, colleges, and other higher education providers, ensuring that each of them is meeting their obligations to students. This includes maintaining high quality teaching and ensuring the rights of students are protected. Universities and colleges must meet minimum requirements, what we call conditions of registration, to register and stay registered with us. Our approach to regulation focuses on two areas of work: quality and standards and equality of opportunity. We also ensure that every university and college has effective governance arrangements in place. Next slide, please. So our consultation is proposing a new condition of registration. The consultation was published on the 23rd of February, and we're now holding webinars, including this one today and one earlier this week, which was primarily for universities and colleges. There's a recording of that event on our website if you would like to see that one as well. It covers broadly the same topics, but you're very welcome to view it. In April, we will be holding roundtables with students to gather views. So you're very welcome to submit a consultation response through our online form, but this will be another way through which we can understand student responses to the consultation. Details will be posted on our website closer to the time. So the deadline to respond to the consultation is the 4th of May. We will then be analysing submissions. We will publish the outcomes of the consultation later in 2023, and subject to the responses to the consultation and decisions subsequently taken by the OFS, there will be a 3-month implementation period. So universities and colleges would need to have implemented all of the elements of the condition no later than 3 months after we publish our decision. We have covered implementation periods in the consultation under Proposal G, and we welcome views on those. There's been some good work by universities and colleges on addressing harassment and sexual misconduct, but progress across the sector has been too slow and inconsistent, as was found by the independent evaluation of our statement of expectations. Self-regulation has not delivered the change that we think students are entitled to, and the issues of harassment and sexual misconduct can have a huge effect on the lives of students. We're eager to hear from students, universities and colleges, and anyone else with an interest in reducing harassment and sexual misconduct in higher education. Next slide, please. So I'll now hand over to Misha, who will tell us why she is passionate about this work and why you should get involved by sharing your views and encouraging others to do the same. Thanks, Misha.
Thanks, Emma. Hi everyone, I'm Misha, and as has been said, I'm a member of the Office for Students student panel. I joined the panel last September, and I'm currently a postgraduate research student. I'm doing my PhD at Oxford. So I'm here to talk to you about why I think it's really important for students to be involved in this consultation and share your views. As students, we have the right to learn and live in an environment where we feel safe and know we're protected. Students can find themselves in really vulnerable positions. Perhaps you're going to university or college for the first time. Maybe that would mean moving to a new place. There are multiple factors that will affect different people in different ways. Even if you've not physically moved away from home, you can find yourself in a brand new environment with new peers and lots of new expectations. It can be really hard to have the confidence to report harassment or sexual misconduct, and sometimes it can be hard to even recognise it, especially if you're in a vulnerable position. So that's why it's really important to ensure that institutions not only have the right approach and tools to deal with issues when they're occurring, but also to prevent them from happening. Protecting students and preventing harassment and sexual misconduct is critical. The best way for regulation to be effective is to hear from students directly, because it is going to directly affect students. Personally, I've been involved in this work as a student panel member. So I filmed a video to encourage students to share their views on how the OFS can regulate to prevent and address harassment, abuse and sexual misconduct in universities and colleges, because I think it's really important to hear from students. And also as a panel, we've discussed the proposals and we've given feedback. But it's really important to hear from as many people as possible, and especially as many students as possible, because we'll get individual views and experiences. So getting involved in this will not only create a better awareness and understanding, but not only for the OFS to get students' views, but also for students to be aware of what's being proposed and being able to express your views on it, because you'll see how it can affect you directly. This is a chance for you to have your say, and if students are involved and are heard, it's the most effective way to ensure that there are relevant preventative and protective measures in place. So it's great that you're here today engaging with this webinar, and I would really encourage you to respond in the consultation and make sure your views are heard. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Misha. And yeah, I think it's that kind of last point is really important, that the more individual views we have, the more we understand student responses and student feelings about the consultation. So I will now hand over to Amy, who will say more about the background to this work.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much, Misha, as well, for your really encouraging messages, and thank you for everything you've done contributing to this work to date. We thought it might be helpful to rehearse some of the background which has led to the development of this proposed condition of ongoing registration with the OFS. So firstly, we know that the evidence points to the presence of and prevalence of harassment and sexual misconduct in higher education. Analysis done by the Office of National Statistics of the Crime Survey of England and Wales in 2021 found that students of the occupational group most likely to have experienced sexual assault. And it's important to note, actually, in that crime survey, it doesn't include students in halls of residence. So even excluding all of that large proportion of students who live in halls of any sort, both owned by the university and privately owned, students still come out as the occupational group most likely to experience sexual assault. So I think that's a really, really important and significant statistic. The Equality and Human Rights Commission's inquiry into racial harassment in 2019 found that nearly 1 in 3 Black and Asian students had experienced racial harassment on campus in the 12 months running up to that survey. And they also found that only 1 in 3 of the students who'd experienced that harassment had reported it to their university. And I think you're probably familiar that this is echoed in low levels of reporting of sexual violence, sexual assault, rapes, and serious sexual misconduct. There's a very, very low proportion of those incidents reported to the police. And that is evidence, those are statistics and evidence which is collected by Rape Crisis England and Wales. So the evidence base is really stark. There is a serious issue here. And it's helpful to also remind you perhaps what the OFS has done on this to date, and where this new condition, this new enormous consultation has come from. So this consultation builds on previous work that we have done, but also important evidence gained from others' work and research in the sector, so the likes of Universities UK, many activists out in the sector, including student leaders, the NUS, researchers, grassroots groups, campaign groups. You'll see in Annex it's one of the annexes, the consultation. They've moved around a bit, but there is an evidence annex, and you'll see we've incorporated a great deal of surveys and evidence and research which has been undertaken. So the policy work we're building on, but also the research work. Added to that, we provided through our Catalyst Fund £4.7 million to 119 projects to tackle sexual misconduct, online harassment, and religious-based hate crime between 2017 and 2020. We've evaluated that work, and lots of resources that were created from these projects can be found on our website, and they're all freely available. In April 2021, so building on the work we've done with the Catalyst Fund, building on various bits of research and surveys that have been undertaken in the sector, we published a statement of expectations. And it described how providers should prevent and respond to incidents of harassment and sexual misconduct. This wasn't subject to regulation by us, so it was, to all intents and purposes, sort of voluntary good practice that could be adopted by providers. We really strongly encouraged its uptake and adoption. We did a lot of communication and engagement around this, including with sector and stakeholder groups, and we wanted to really understand its impact. The statement of expectations provided a consistent set of recommendations, and it really focused on prevention and response. So all of the systems, policies and processes needed to do that prevention piece, disciplinary codes, governance arrangements, reporting systems, and then the response in terms of running effective disciplinary and investigation processes. We wanted to understand how that had landed over the last academic year, what change it had made, how students felt about whether things had got better for them on campus since the publication of the statement. And so we commissioned an independent evaluation of the statement which took place in the 21-22 academic year, and this was published last November. As Emma's mentioned, the evaluation found that progress had been made. There had been positive steps in many areas across the sector, but overall, progress was slow. It was still too slow, and there were still too many inconsistencies across the sector. We found that approaches that providers were taking, the universities and colleges were taking, were just really variable. That the student experiences of when they'd made a report and they were going through the investigatory process were sometimes really poor, and not at the professional standard that they should reasonably anticipate. We found that there was a really variable approach to staff and student training. We did a survey of 100 universities and colleges, and around 70% of our respondents said that they had mandatory training for at least some staff in relation to handling disclosures of harassment and sexual misconduct. And actually 70%, that's not really enough in terms of the number of staff who are actually professionally trained to deal with those really important and sensitive disclosures. The evaluation, interestingly, also found that universities and colleges have prioritised student-to-student sexual misconduct with far more limited work and interventions in relation to staff-to-student misconduct or other forms of harassment, so anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, LGBT, hate incidents or harassment, or any other forms of harassment. And you can see that then is leaving some groups of students really not feeling that they've got the protection of the provider. Next slide, please. So I would now like to run briefly through a summary of the 7 consultation proposals. Within some of these proposals, we've presented options, and we welcome consultation responses around these. There's options through the survey that you're asked to fill in response to the consultation. We've asked some specific questions around those. So, for example, there are 2 options presented around the proposal relating to staff-student relationships. And we've also explained which options we've provisionally discounted on all the proposals. So you'll see some other options presented, and then some pros and cons listed out, and usually an indication of whether we've discounted that option and the reason why. So let's just quickly run through all the proposals, and I shall make sure I give them their proper letter titles. So proposal A That talks about introducing a proposed ongoing condition, which we're going to call E6. And it also includes definitions that we're proposing to use for harassment, basically what is harassment in this context and what is sexual misconduct. We'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. Proposal B, this requires a university or college to develop and publish a single document with minimum content requirements. And Gemma's going to talk us through what that means, what's in that minimum content requirements. Proposal C relates to capacity and resources. This is one of two proposals which we haven't explicitly covered later in this presentation, but it's basically saying that we'd expect a university or college to have the capacity and resources necessary to make sure they can comply with this condition. It might be appropriate for resources to be allocated in particular where certain student groups are more likely to face harassment or sexual misconduct and may require additional support to continue their studies successfully. So that's basically us saying you need to understand who your student body are and where might certain risks present themselves, and what does your situation look like at the moment. And we've set out in the draft guidance, which goes along with this condition, that a provider might determine the approach it takes to ensuring it has sufficient capacity and resources. And that could include by sharing services with other organisations or providers. Proposal D relates to freedom of speech and the principles that we'd expect to be consistently applied whilst implementing this condition. Proposal E is around our proposals to prohibit the use of non-disclosure agreements. We'll talk a bit more about that. Proposal F are the requirements relating to personal relationships between staff and students. And proposal G is around our proposed implementation period. This is one of the two proposals not explicitly covered later in the presentation, but we did touch on it in the timeline slide earlier. Next slide, please. So we're going to now run through the proposals in a little more detail, and then we'll take a pause for some questions and answers. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about the definitions that we're proposing to use for the purposes of this proposed condition of registration. We think it's really important that there are clear definitions for both harassment and sexual misconduct to ensure transparency and consistency and protection for students. I think, as Emma mentioned, kind of the remit of the OFS is that these things apply to all students. So our provisions apply to all students, regardless of where they study, who they study with, and where the incident of harassment or misconduct occurs, i.e. on or off campus. It's really important to note the following. The harassment definitions, both in the Equality Act and in the Prevention of Harassment Act, contain objectivity and reasonableness tests, meaning that it's not only the perspective of the individual, the person who feels they're being harassed, that's important in judging whether harassment has taken place. There also has to be an objectivity and reasonable test applied. This is really important because all speech is protected under the law unless it is found to be unlawful. And we've described this in more detail in paragraphs 22 and 25 of the consultation document. We've offered here a definition of sexual misconduct, which is a little broader because it includes this phrase which we've popped in bold, which includes but is not limited to the examples we've given. And we've been very specific here that it's about sexual harassment as defined by section 26.2 of the Equality Act 2010, and then two specific offences from the Sexual Offences Act 2003, and those are described in the Sexual Offences Act very precisely, but it is a sexual assault and rape. But because we've said includes but is not limited to, other sexual misconduct which is unwanted or attempted unwanted conduct of a sexual nature could be included. And we've left that a little bit broader because this is an area of quite swift social and legal change. And we wanted to make sure that we future-proofed this to a certain extent, so that where new offences come onto the statute books, they wouldn't be precluded. There's been a huge amount of new legislation around sexual misconduct since sort of 2017, 2018, and there's likely to be more to come. So that's why we've framed that in that way. And I shall now hand over to Gemma. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Amy. I'm going to talk a bit about some of the detail of the single document that Amy's previously mentioned. I just wanted to pause just to say I can see some questions popping up in the chat around whether the slides and the recordings are going to be available online. Those will all be available online, so don't feel that you've got to frantically take notes. And I'm also conscious that we've already covered quite a lot of content in this, and you may very well have questions already. So do feel free to not wait until the Q&A and just start putting questions in the Q&A box. And we can obviously address that when we get to the appropriate time. Okay, so as I said, I'm going to talk about our proposal that all providers should have to create and comply with a single document setting out their approach to harassment and sexual misconduct. We're proposing this because we think it's really important that you as students have all the information you need at your fingertips, so that you know what your provider is doing, and then if unfortunately you ever experience an incident of harassment or sexual misconduct, you don't need to go digging through your intranet or digging through multiple policies to know how to get the support that you're entitled to. We've also proposed that the document should be prominently published, essentially meaning it should be easy to find for all students and applicants. And when we say prominently published, we also mean it needs to be public, because we also think this is the kind of thing that applicants are going to be thinking about when they choose where to study. So that's the reason for the proposal for a single document. We've also said that there should be what we call minimum content requirements for this document. First and foremost, the minimum content requirement is that a provider should have to develop and include in its single document multiple steps which could make a significant and credible difference in protecting students from harassment and sexual misconduct. And that might include steps that could reduce the prevalence of harassment and sexual misconduct. So it requires a provider to actually engage with the challenges or experiences that its students might be facing and set out steps to address this. They need to be multiple steps, they need to be credible steps, and a provider that complied with all of the other minimum content requirements but did not comply with this minimum content requirement would not be compliant. A provider, so a university or college, sorry, we sometimes call them providers, but I try and call them universities and colleges. Your university or college will need to decide for itself what steps it needs to take, because obviously that will depend on its individual context and the types of students that study there. But we have included some examples in the condition guidance. So for example, some of the steps that we might be likely to consider to be appropriate might be considering the potential needs of different student groups and engaging with those students to understand their views. Collecting, monitoring and publishing data where this is likely to inform effective action to tackle harassment and sexual misconduct, and undertaking credible and evidence-based evaluation of the effectiveness of its steps to tackle harassment and sexual misconduct. So that's the kind of first and not most important, but a really important minimum content requirement. But there's a number of other things that the document should include as well. So it needs to explain its arrangements for student support, training for staff and students, how someone can report an incident of harassment or sexual misconduct and what they might expect throughout that reporting journey, what an investigation might entail or might look like, and also information handling and how people will be informed of the outcomes of an investigation. I'll talk about the detail of all of these things in the next slides, but what this means in practice is that essentially you should be able to refer to the single document and see all of the information that you need, and be able to then approach your provider and say, I have experienced this, unfortunately, I need some support, or I want to understand what you're doing to tackle harassment and sexual misconduct, and provide feedback on the steps that they are taking. We've also proposed what we're calling content principles for this document, and what this essentially means is that a university or college can include more information in a single document that isn't required by the minimum content requirements, because obviously there will be different needs and different contexts for each university or college. It might make sense to include some other elements in that document for ease of understanding for you. What this means is that any additional information that's included in the document can't contradict, undermine, or conflict with the minimum content requirements, and that the minimum content requirements take precedence over any other information or provisions. Okay, next slide, please, Dawn. Great, thank you. Okay, so as I've said, provide a single document as well as explaining how it will tackle harassment and sexual misconduct, must also explain what to do when someone experiences harassment and sexual misconduct. Obviously, anyone who experiences an incident doesn't have to report it if they don't want to, but you should obviously know that this is an option available. A university or college is required to have appropriate reporting systems and to comply with the reporting arrangements that it describes in a single document. We've suggested that a provider might want to look at how it could address barriers to reporting and whether it needs a range of options for reporting, such as both online or in person. Unfortunately, someone who's experienced an incident of harassment or sexual misconduct might feel anxious about what's going to happen with their report. For example, if there might be, if there is a criminal element involved or where a member of staff is involved. We've therefore said that the document should explain how information will be handled and that students making a report will know how the information they report will be used. For example, if it might be used during a disciplinary process for a member of staff. We've also said that a provider should ensure that investigations undertaken and decisions made are credible, fair, and otherwise reflect established principles of natural justice. And what this essentially means is that the process is free from any reasonable perception of bias. This is because we recognise that a student may be accused of harassment or sexual misconduct, and that student has a right to a fair investigation. Again, providers can make their own judgments on how they will describe these arrangements, but it might cover things like the decision-making process for investigations, for example. A provider's single document would also need to explain how students are told of the outcomes of investigations. We're aware that unfortunately sometimes students haven't always been told this, and we set out our really clear view that all individuals involved in a harassment and sexual misconduct incident should be informed of the outcome of any incident. What that exactly looks like and the level of detail that's disclosed is likely to depend on a case-by-case basis, and we'd expect providers to make reasonable judgments about that. But we have set out our view that everyone should be informed. I'm conscious that I've just kind of sped through some very complex issues. We have also set out staff training requirements to ensure that staff are appropriately trained and have the necessary knowledge and skills to deliver the requirements of the single document. So, if there's anything in there that's confusing, you should be able to approach an appropriate member of staff and they should be able to explain that to you. Staff also need to understand the freedom of speech principles, which I'll talk about in the second half of this presentation. Next slide, please. Thanks. Okay, so before we get to the first Q&A session, I want to spend some time explaining the requirements we've proposed relating to support for students. Universities and colleges under our proposals must provide and explain in the single document how they'll provide this appropriate to support students. We've included in the condition guidance a number of examples of what this might look like, and you may want to take a look at this. In general, we've said that universities and colleges should be providing support for all students involved in an incident of harassment or sexual misconduct, regardless of whether or not it proceeds to a formal report or investigation. So this means that if unfortunately you experience an incident, you do not have to report to ask for and receive support. This covers victims, survivors, witnesses or bystanders, and any actual or alleged perpetrators of harassment or sexual misconduct. It's important to note that the requirement for a provider to support actual or alleged perpetrators doesn't mean that the provider can't proceed with fair and transparent investigations or disciplinary processes as a result of a report, just that appropriate support should be provided for all students during that process. Next slide, please. Thanks. Okay. In terms of what appropriate support might look like, we've defined appropriate support in the proposed condition. We think this is important because we think all students should have a shared understanding of what is expected from their university or college, and all students should be able to expect a minimum level of support from their university or college. And because the provider would be required to explain in its single document how it will provide appropriate support, you should also all be able to understand from that document what support you're entitled to. Appropriate support is defined as including both personal support, including in the form of counselling where appropriate, and academic support, including in relation to decisions about attendance, continuation, suspension, or stopping study entirely. So we're conscious that, unfortunately, if someone experiences an incident and there may very well be an impact on that person's study, the provider will be obligated to support you through deciding what are the best next steps for you. A university or college can decide for itself how it provides that appropriate support. So it could deliver its own counselling services, or it could commission support from other organisations, or make appropriate and effective referrals to other service providers. The support needs to be appropriate for the student's individual needs. Academic support, for example, might involve supporting students to handle changes to attendance or applying for extenuating circumstances. Most importantly, I just want to reiterate the point about students not being required to submit a report to be eligible to receive support. Okay. Next slide, please. Thanks. Okay, we've also proposed that students should be appropriately taught about matters relating to harassment and sexual misconduct and how their university or college is addressing this. So this means ensuring that students understand the content of a single document, and also providing induction sessions, repeated sessions where necessary, to ensure that students understand what kinds of behaviour might amount to harassment or sexual misconduct. We've also proposed bystander training for potential witnesses. This should be underpinned by credible evidence and evaluation, and designed and delivered by those with expertise. So this is likely to include people who understand how important it is to undertake such training, and that such training is sensitive to the needs of individual students. Okay, I've just run through quite a lot here. I'm going to pass back to Emma now in preparation for our first Q&A session.
Brilliant. Thanks, Gemma, and thanks, Amy. Like you say, you've covered an awful lot of information, but it's all really important, really interesting, and we're getting some interesting questions through on the Q&A. Please do continue to submit them, and submit them through the next presentation as well, and we can pick up those in the Q&A session a little later in the webinar as well. Okay then, so to start us off, I think a good starter question, how will the proposed changes lead to students being better protected from harassment and sexual misconduct?
Shall I start with that one, Gemma?
Yes, if you could. Thanks, Amy.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, Emma. I think that's a really good starter question. So I guess the first thing is that there would be a far more consistent set of regulated expectations on universities and colleges for the systems, policies and processes we'd expect them to have in place. That's that minimum those minimum content requirements. And that includes, really important things like having the proper reporting system, having mandatory training for staff and students, and really making sure that all of that bedrock of support for students is in place, and then the proper systems, the proper professional investigatory and proper disciplinary processes, arrangements for sharing information, etc., all there. And then additional and enhanced protections for students, particularly those who are victims of and survivors of harassment or sexual misconduct, with things like the prohibition of NDAs that we're proposing. We'll talk a bit more about those, and so I don't want to preempt everything I'm going to say about NDAs, but not having students who've been victims of this, of these, you know, horrendous incidents, being silenced essentially afterwards. We're putting proposals in around you know, really limiting staff and student relationships, and really trying to tackle that staff to student sexual misconduct. So there's a range of provisions in here which should raise the bar in terms of the protection for students, the prevention of these incidents, and then we'd expect a far superior response, a much more professional, empathetic response to students who have suffered this.
Thanks, Amy. I've got another question that's related, so maybe another one for you. Do you think this work will have a positive influence on higher education providers in the devolved nations?
Thanks. And of course, this is not just an issue for providers in England. These, you know, harassment and sexual misconduct does not stop at the Severn Bridge or I can't think of other famous bits of border, but clearly it's an international issue, and we've been, you know, a lot of our work, we've been taking note of progress across Europe, progress and policy in Australia, the United States, etc. So yes, and we talk quite regularly to our counterparts in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. There are different types of, there is a different kind of policy legislative context in the devolved nations, all of whom have some focus on whether it's as widespread as harassment and all forms of harassment and sexual misconduct, or whether there's a particular focus on as part of their violence against women and girls strategies, for example. But I can tell you that Northern Ireland, in the higher education funders in Northern Ireland, Department for the Economy in Northern Ireland, have introduced a statement of expectations on tackling harassment and sexual misconduct. And I'm talking to counterparts in Wales and Scotland who are really interested in becoming part of the prevalence survey work, which we also announced late last year. So conducting a national prevalence survey on to collect data about sexual misconduct. So there are definite opportunities there to work more closely together, and there's a lot of commitment and potential further alignment. Obviously, providers in universities and colleges outside of England won't be subject to any of this new regulation that we're discussing today, though.
Great, thanks, Amy. So moving on, we've got some questions about the single document. So the single document may be inaccessible if it contains lots of long, complex regulations. Would it therefore also be appropriate for an accessible summary of the single document? Maybe one for Gemma.
Yeah. Thanks, Emma. I think that's a really good question. That's something that we grappled with. We thought it was really important to have everything in one place so that people would know where to go to. But because, you know, providers will need to set out substantive, detailed their substantive approach on reporting, on student support, on the steps that they will take to tackle harassment and sexual misconduct, it's likely to be a substantive document, depending on the level of steps that a provider needs to take. So I think we'd be really keen for feedback from students on all of our proposals, but I think it would be helpful to get students' views on whether that's what's helpful for them.
Great, thanks, Gemma. And a question about the process, really. So how will the single document be reviewed and monitored to ensure that each institution meets the set standards? Will there be guidelines for this?
Yeah. I'm happy to take that one. So we've set out quite high level requirements, but detailed requirements, if that makes sense. We try to strike an appropriate balance between providing a level of detail that's helpful for providers in interpreting the requirements that we've proposed, whilst not being prescriptive, because they will obviously need to be able to respond to their individual contexts. And the best way, I guess, for us to know if a provider isn't meeting the obligations that it has committed for itself in its single document is for people to let us know about this. Hopefully, a lot of the people attending here will know about the OFS notifications process, which you mentioned earlier, Emma. But essentially what this does, it means that anyone could submit a notification to us if they think a provider might not be compliant with our requirements. And obviously one of the proposed requirements for this would be that a provider must publish and comply with a single document. So anything like that, I think, would be keen to be told.
Yeah, brilliant. Hopefully quite a short question. Just last one, I think, on the single document that's come up so far is, could the document be a web page to improve accessibility, as a single document, as highlighted, could be a barrier?
Again, that's a really helpful point, and I think if people feel that's the better way forward, we did consider this because we know that some providers have this, but it's important to strike a balance of what's appropriate for all universities and colleges with 400 plus registered providers. Some are going to be much further on in their journey and having substantive web pages set up. And some are very small and may not have progressed that far. So because we want to ensure that all students have the same kind of experience in terms of the level of information they're provided with, we just need to balance expectations. But again, keen to hear students' views on all of our proposals.
Thanks, Gemma. So moving now on to definitions, and I think a question for Amy. There's a couple of questions that have come up, and I'm going to summarise them a little bit. There's a question about the definition of rape in the Sexual Offences Act, which is one of the examples we've given in our definitions of sexual misconduct, and also how that links to assault by penetration. I'm wondering, Amy, if you could speak a little bit more about the definition of sexual misconduct which we've included.
Yeah, sure. So I went through it in the slides, but I think it's probably important to say that we've included that phrase, includes but is not limited to, and we've also described attempted actual. Let me just go and look at the slide again while I'm speaking, otherwise I'm going to stutter, so just bear with me 2 seconds. So we've talked about sexual misconduct meaning any unwanted or attempted unwanted conduct of a sexual nature, and includes but is not limited to. So that the definition of sexual harassment, which is obviously civil law, not criminal, as defined by section 26.2 of the Equality Act. And then we have highlighted two criminal two acts which are defined in criminal law, which is the Sexual Offences Act 2003. We've highlighted assault, sexual assault, and we've highlighted rape. Now there's some, I can see some discussion in the Q&A around there is also clearly assault by penetration, and that is included in the definition of assault in the Sexual Offences Act, and the very specific definition of rape, which is included in the Sexual Offences Act. But I think I'd like to draw your attention that it includes both of those, but it's not limited to both of those, plus the legal definition of sexual harassment. Is that helpful?
Yeah, and I think you touched on it earlier, Amy, about the kind of, we've not set it out as a comprehensive list of legal definitions of what could constitute sexual misconduct, because of the kind of changing legislative landscape and wanting to ensure that it covers that really broad range of misconduct. So that's the kind of basis on which we've built. But again, we welcome feedback on any of this. If students want to submit a consultation response, that's really interesting to hear.
Yeah, I think that's right, Emma. I think if the definitions, so the definitions are pretty open-ended, because we've said that includes but is not limited to. So I think it's really important that participants take away the fact that we're not just very narrowly defining rape or sexual assault as being the only things that absolutely could be included, because it's not limited to, and there's quite a broad range of incidents, offences, things that could happen, which would be defined under that unwanted or attempted unwanted conduct of a sexual nature. So, but if participants feel, if students who are reading the consultation feel that is not drawn in perhaps the right way, or those definitions don't make sense to them, then I think we'd be really interested to hear about that.
Yeah, and that's a really helpful clarification, Amy. Thank you.
Can I just add on that particular point, just to say, I think part of the reason why we've done it in this way, because the more things you try and list there, the more chance there is that someone could say, well, that is a prescriptive list, even if it's said including but not limited to. So by keeping it drawn narrowly in that way, we also kind of allow scope for it to change in the future as new things, new issues emerge.
Thanks, Gemma. Okay, so I'm going to move on to some questions we've had on training. So does training include disclosure training? That's a very short and sweet question. Gemma, would you like to go for it?
So it's not something that we have specifically listed in there, but we've essentially said that students should be appropriately taught. And the appropriate teaching should include at least covering, we've proposed bystander training and the content of the single document. I think it's then for providers to make their own reasonable judgments about the support and training that they think their students need. So if a student feels like that's the kind of thing that would be valuable to them, I would encourage them to reach out to their provider if they feel it's appropriate and suggest that.
And maybe a question for Amy now. So how will training be judged to be appropriate? For example, not online optional activity that people can just click through.
Yeah, so that's quite important. And we've been actually fairly prescriptive for us on something which is something that is definitely going to be delivered. We'd expect providers to be universities and colleges to be delivering themselves. So we've said that we do not think, and this is in the sort of guidance that we've put out, the draft guidance we put out that goes along with the condition, that the training needs to be evidence-based. It needs to be evaluated. It needs to be delivered by someone with sufficient credibility and expertise. And it needs to have opportunities for discussion and questions and answers. So a kind of online half-hour long click module is unlikely to satisfy the requirements of this condition. So we're looking for something which is, we've said it needs to be interactive, it needs to be credible, it needs to be evidence-based. So and we've suggested that bystander training, so the training which also covers not just disclosures and consent, but also that might cover witnesses as well. It should cover witnesses as well. And we've specifically said bystander training would be useful and could well satisfy the condition here. So we have been fairly prescriptive. How providers do that, who they get in to run it, which training program they want to operate, that's all up for them to determine. We've also said in the guidance that we'd expect for a range of these areas that we'd expect them to speak to their students as well, and to consult with students and to engage with students around what they want to see and what is the most effective kind of format of the training for them.
Great. And last one on training, I think we've had a couple of questions on this area, and it's about bystander training. Would that be mandatory during enrolment or for enrolment?
So we, as Amy's already said, we proposed that bystander training should be included. I think on a practical level, so for example, in terms of the timing of introducing this condition, it's likely to kind of be introduced throughout the in the next academic year, obviously subject to decision making whether of course it is taken forward. So limiting it to just enrolment might not be appropriate. So I think we just expect providers to make appropriate judgments about when it should happen.
Great, thanks, Gemma. So we're time now to move on to the next session for the latter proposals of the consultation. There's a few more questions that have come through. We'll try and pick them up in the next session in about 15-20 minutes or so. So I'll pass back to Gemma now for the next set of proposals.
Okay. Thanks. Next slide, please. Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. Thanks very much. Okay. So yeah, moving on to proposals D through F. So proposal, I say that I think it's D. Don't quote me on that. So we have proposed freedom of speech principles, and these are essentially that a university or college must have particular regard to and place significant weight on the importance of freedom of speech within the law, academic freedom and tolerance for controversial views. The principles also refer to what's called a rebuttable presumption, which in this context, it essentially means that exposure of students to course materials or views expressed by a person as part of teaching, research, or discussions about subject matter, which might include, for example, events or guest speakers, is unlikely to constitute harassment unless this is proven to be the case. We've gone into a fair amount of detail on this just because we recognise that it's a particularly challenging area for providers to navigate. Essentially the way the freedom of speech works is that all speech is lawful unless it's proven to be unlawful. And we've previously published a paper setting out providers' legal obligations in this space, which we could link to in the chat later on if that might be helpful for people. So the freedom of speech principles is designed to provide clarity to providers about what might constitute harassment and is therefore within the scope of this condition. It's important to note, though, that as I've said, exposure of students to course materials or views as part of kind of a course content is unlikely to constitute harassment, but it can be proven to be harassment if it is indeed proven to be the case. That sounds challenging to navigate, but I think what that essentially means is so that it's important that students and staff go away understanding what is likely to be harassment in the context of our proposed condition of registration. And one of the things we've also said here is that it's really important that staff receive appropriate training to enable them to understand the freedom of speech principles, because we recognise it's important to work through these challenging areas. Okay, and I think I'm handing back to Amy now.
You are. Thank you, Gemma. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a bit about the proposals we've set out on non-disclosure agreements. Now we've talked about NDAs, and they can also be known as confidentiality agreements. They've got some different. They can have some different names in operation when they're used by universities and colleges. Many of you will be familiar with the recent work to address the use of non-disclosure agreements in higher education. So particularly the campaign work done by Can't Buy My Silence, who have developed a pledge that universities can sign up to, which says they're not going to use NDAs in cases of harassment or sexual misconduct. Obviously, that's a pledge, and it's a good initiative. Around 80 universities have signed up, and Oxbridge colleges as well have signed up to the pledge. But there's no kind of enforcement or regulation around that. So if university breaks the pledge and does start using NDAs, there's nothing, whilst it would be unethical and hypocritical, there's nothing really at all to stop them from doing that, apart from perhaps bad press, which would be difficult because someone has an NDA on them. So it's quite a difficult situation. So also the Office of the Independent Adjudicator has also recommended the end of the use of NDAs and said they would not consider them to be good practice when they're reviewing complaints which come to them. So what we have proposed in our new condition of registration is that universities and colleges should not impose any restrictions on disclosure or any contracts, and they shouldn't put any restrictions on disclosure into any contracts formed after this condition takes effect. That they shouldn't rely or enforce restrictions on contracts already in place. That's important. So that what we're proposing here is that any existing NDAs couldn't be relied on. So if a student had an NDA or put on them 4 years ago, they wouldn't be able to, a university wouldn't be able to take legal action if a student then decided to speak and spoke out about what had happened to them. And we've also said that a university should take all reasonable steps to prevent any other person from including or relying on terms in contracts that would also seek to prohibit or restrict disclosure. So that's quite an influential and significant piece of potential proposed regulation. We've set it out quite broadly because we think it's unacceptable for any student to be prevented from discussing their experiences of harassment or sexual misconduct. We think that informal arrangements, which are non-contractual and therefore not directly covered by this provision, are also unacceptable. And we also think it would be unacceptable for any student to experience any negative consequences from their university or college if they did decide to disclose their experience. Just to note, for those of you who've been following the Freedom of Speech bill going through Parliament at the moment, there is actually an amendment in that bill which would do a very similar thing. It would prohibit the use of NDAs in harassment and sexual misconduct cases. It's written slightly differently. It's that the amendment as it currently stands, I don't think it has the kind of retrospective piece around it as well on existing NDAs. We don't know. That bill is still going through Parliament. It's in the kind of ping pong stage between the House of Commons and the House of Lords. We don't know quite where that's going to land. And at the moment, we think that it's wise for us we didn't want to wait and delay on this. We thought we'll press ahead with a draft provision. One of the options we've set out in the consultation that we could mirror the language from the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act as and when it's passed, or we can have the wording that we've proposed. So there are two options there. Next slide, please. So I'm going to move on to talk about this point on personal relationships between staff and students. So the rationale for including some potential regulation here is that it's our view that there is a power imbalance between students and staff, where a member of staff has a supervisory, management, support or teaching responsibility for a student. Staff could subject students to harassment or sexual misconduct by exploiting that power imbalance. So, for example, qualitative data gathered as part of a 2017 survey of 30,000 students in Australia across 39 universities suggested that the power disparity between students and teaching staff could make students very vulnerable to sexual harassment. Even where a relevant staff member does not seek to abuse their power, students could potentially experience the negative effects of an inherent power imbalance. Students might feel pressurised to take on a personal relationship with a staff member. They might feel pressurised to take it further than they might otherwise have wished, or may not feel able to end such a relationship on the basis that if they do, that might result in a detriment. So, maybe not receiving a positive review or a reference, an adverse impact on assessments of academic performance, or perhaps not being recommended or receiving PhD funding. Our proposals are intended to discourage staff from engaging in relationships with relevant students. And the proposals in our consultation relate to relationships between students and relevant staff members. So that means a member of staff who has direct or indirect academic responsibilities or other direct professional responsibilities in relation to that student. So it's not a blanket all staff definition, but it could apply to any member of staff who falls into that category for that student. So we think it would be likely to cover academic staff with teaching, supervision or assessment responsibilities, and pastoral staff perhaps with counselling, student complaints or security responsibilities. It would be unlikely to include cleaning or catering staff, or perhaps relationships between two students, one of whom is perhaps working part-time in the library or the shop. These are examples, and obviously universities and colleges will need to use reasonable judgments in determining who is a relevant staff member, erring on the side of caution where needed. We are noting here, and I'm sure we'll get questions about this, that a student can be both a student and a member of staff under the proposed condition. It will be significant in terms of which capacity they're operating in as to whether they are a relevant member of staff. Next slide, please. So this slide just sets out the two options that we have proposed, option A and option B, in terms of how we might go forward and regulate this. So our preferred option, option A, requires a staff member, not the student, requires the staff member to disclose any relationship between a student and a staff member within 3 weeks of that relationship commencing. Personal relationship means a relationship that includes one or more of the following elements: physical intimacy, including isolated or repeated sexual activity, romantic or emotional intimacy, or financial dependency. The nature of the relationship should also be disclosed and the register updated if the nature of the relationship changes. So, i.e., from physical intimacy to financial dependency. We're not requiring the register to be published, and it is not a national register. The OFS would never see the names in it unless the university or college's policies included publication. Option B is proposed because we recognise how serious this issue is, and that some universities and colleges already do ban staff-student relationships. So we're setting this out as an alternative option for consultation, and we are very interested in hearing students' views on how this might work in practice and what your preferences might be. I'm going to hand back to Emma now. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. I'm just having a look at all the questions coming on in. So we've got a bit of time now. We've got 20 minutes or so for further questions. There's a couple I'm going to pick up that came through in the first session. So I'm going to start with those if I just scroll up to where we were before. So a couple back on the single document. I might pull these together just for speed. So Gemma, maybe one for you. Will there be requirements on how the single document is publicised or advertised to students? And then a slightly different question, but I'll bring it together. Are providers required to publish information on reporting?
Yeah, I was just trying to find, I had the exact lines that I wanted to reference and I've just lost them. So providers must, under the proposals, a provider would be required to explain what its reporting systems look like, and we are requiring under the proposals that all providers should have appropriate reporting systems. So any student should be able to go to the single document and know exactly how to report an incident. If that wasn't the case, I think we might potentially have concerns. In relation to publication, we have actually set out specific requirements around this. We have essentially said that the document should be prominently published. So what this means is the document should be published on a prominent position in an area of the provider's website which is easily accessible to students and applicants without the need for any form of password or security checks, so it shouldn't be hidden on the intranet essentially. The document needs to be clear and easy to understand. There should be a statement about the document, the nature of its contents and how to access it, which should be made available to all staff and all students at least once each calendar year. It should be set out as the main documents designed to promote higher education services, so for example prospectuses, and also set out as any documents that are designed to provide a collection of useful information about rules, policies and procedures, so for example student handbooks and staff handbooks. So we've been quite prescriptive in this area, but what essentially the aim here is that, you know, anywhere you go that's an important document, you should then be told how to access the single document.
Well, thank you. And so coming back to the reporting, and I think this question may be for Amy to start with. So the participant has kind of set out that a significant barrier that stops students from reporting is that students might not have confidence in the university disciplinary procedures, or that they may not be kind of suitable for the reporting student for the alleged victim survivor, especially for what is seen as lower risk offences that aren't easily proved. So does the single document, or does anything in the consultation kind of address this lack of faith in reporting systems by the university and college?
So obviously we're coming at it from a slightly different angle, in that we're coming at it from what we expect the university and college to have in place, rather than some of the activities it might do to raise trust and confidence in students in its processes. However, I think we're talking about the same thing here, because I think we're talking about when you think about the ingredients the different elements that we're requiring here in terms of transparency. So high levels of transparency. The single document, Gemma was just saying, which needs to be accessible, entirely accessible to students and promoted to students. And actually, we've gone further than that. We've said and taught to students in a way, you know, and not just flashed in front of them as something to sign in their first week. Actually to really in detail explain to students how this works, what the expectations are of them in terms of codes of conduct, but also what is made available to them in terms of how to make a report, and here's what will happen if you do. So we hope that via having the building blocks in place, having those policies and systems in place, making them transparent, telling students about them, and then operating them, doing that work of taking all reasonable steps to prevent and respond to, and then doing the training and training the staff and training the students. You'd hope that trust and confidence, that the aim and the outcome of all of that activity is that trust and confidence is raised with students. You know, we really care what students think and how they feel about this, and talking to students was a really important part of the evaluation of our statement of expectations. And it was from discussions with students, with stakeholder groups, with grassroots groups, with campaign groups, and people and including victim survivors who had been through those complaints processes, those reporting processes, that we learned that students did not have, they were not receiving a really good, you know, effective and professional service in many cases, or professional response and support, and that narrative is that, you know, then that becomes a narrative which damages trust in other students. And it was through that we learned that actually the processes weren't, that, you know, the operation of the processes weren't good enough, actually, and weren't consistent enough. And it's what's led us to this day. It's led us to doing what we're doing. And so how students feel, the trust and confidence and faith that students have, that knowing that if they come forward, they'll be believed, that knowing if they come forward, they will have access to support, that support is appropriate, that they can be signposted out to any relevant services they may need to access, a sexual assault referral centre, for example, local rape crisis and sexual assault centres, that there is that once those are in place and students can see they're in place, if their peers go through it, that they know that they can see that they're being very well treated and well supported, that trust and confidence will increase. But I am not going to pretend that this is all there and in place, and us issuing a consultation, a new regulation is going to fix how students feel about this. But I hope that in the actions that we're asking our universities and colleges to take, that trust and confidence can be built. But we're going to keep it, we will keep asking, keep evaluating, and keep our eyes on this. And actually the new prevalence survey, which does ask a lot of questions about, you'll see when it's published, but we're working on questions which are about the kind of climate on campus, about whether students know about how to report and whether they have trust and confidence. That will also help us understand how this condition is landing.
Brilliant, thanks, Amy. As you predicted, Amy, we have quite a few questions on staff-student relationships, so I'm going to move on to that area now. So we've had a couple of questions on why we are indicating a preference for option A, which is the register of relationships, over option B, which is a ban on relationships. So why are we not proposing to ban staff-student relationships instead of keeping a register?
I'm happy to take this one unless you want to, Amy. Yeah. Yes, as Amy kind of said at the beginning of this, that this is the only part of the consultation where we have specifically set out a kind of detailed alternative proposal to our current preferred option, because we know that that is a step that some providers have already chosen to take, and that some of the sector have proposed option B, which is an outright ban. We did carefully consider all of the factors in determining our proposed option, and ultimately it came down to the fact that option A, we think, is a credible option that can help address the risk of harassment and abuse and sexual abuse from staff to students through the recording of the relationships, through requiring providers to have solid and comprehensive policies in place to address that, and through requiring providers to take disciplinary action if a staff member refused to disclose a relationship. So we thought that was a really credible option that could address the issue. And we also recognise that option B, whilst supported by a number of people, does represent I'm not going to say imposition, but it does represent more of a challenge to the autonomy of the provider and the autonomy of the individuals involved in that relationship than option A did. So that is why we've set out option A as our preferred option. But with this proposal, as with any other proposal, we really welcome responses on this.
Yeah, I think that final point, Gemma, is really important. As a regulator, we have to take into account a range of factors, and like you pointed to there, the kind of an individual's right to a private life as well is something that we've taken into account. So all of that has kind of come together to inform our preferred options. But as you've pointed out, Gemma, it is a consultation, and we're gathering more evidence and information that we will take into account in our final decision. So again, encourage responses from attendees, from everybody. So there's another question on relationships. So what if the relationship is pre-existing, particularly given that more and more mature students are coming back into higher education?
Yeah, I mean, I think the preferred A option completely takes account for that. So under our preferred option, any pre-existing relationships would need to be recorded and registered rather, and the provider would need to take appropriate steps to mitigate the risks if that person was a relevant staff member. And obviously that relevant staff member is a really important factor. They need to make a judgment about whether in the context of that student, that staff member, that they are relevant.
Yeah, brilliant. And there are already some exemptions that we've suggested already as a starting point, for example, marriage or civil partnership. But if there are other exemptions that people feel are important, and again, we welcome views on that. So another question on the personal relationship side is, so why is the IFS seeking to apply a register that is designed on the structure of a monogamous and long-term romantic relationship when there are other structures and styles of relationships such as polyamorous relationships? Amy, I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, sure. I don't think we've necessarily defined it in that way. We have offered a couple of, we've offered a couple of exemptions which are certainly based on marriage and civil partnership, which yes is perhaps a more traditional form of formalized type of relationship. But I don't think that, for example, in a polyamorous relationship or any other structure of relationship, that the principles would be applied in any different way, because I think you'd still need to balance the fact that one or more people may be in a relationship, that there may well, that the power imbalance piece could absolutely still stand. And the potential, at the very least, conflict of interest piece would still stand, so relevant staff member still is, even if it's staff member / with an S, to take account for a polyamorous relationship. I don't think that would change what that staff member would need to do in terms of registering that relationship and being transparent about it. I recognise it's potentially an unusual situation that the provider would need to deal with, and there also, there's we've considered this. We have considered this. There are privacy implications here, that people may or may not wish to have, necessarily out themselves or disclose that sort of information about themselves, particularly in a kind of in a slightly different form of romantic relationship. But we do think we think the privacy concerns are outweighed with the concerns for potential power imbalance and potential for misconduct. So we do think it's really important, and so in that scenario there would need to be a level of confidentiality attached to that kind of disclosure.
Thanks, Amy. It's quite a specific question now. Would administrative staff who support courses be covered by your definition of a relevant staff member, or also technical support staff?
I think that all comes down to the specific position that person is in, the person that they are in a relationship with. So everything comes back to the relevance definition. So, for example, if that technical or administrative staff member was very directly involved in that student's course, then they may very well fall under the definition of relevant. If they have nothing to do with that person on a day-to-day basis, and they're in entirely separate faculties, for example, they might not be considered to be relevant. So providers will need to make reasonable judgments here.
Thanks, Gemma. So one participant has said, our university already has an outright ban on relationships, I'm putting that bit in, but students often are not aware that these policies exist. Are there plans for ensuring that A, students know about these policies, and B, measuring the effectiveness of these policies?
That's a really good question. This is the advantage of the single document, that the single document needs to explain the provider's approach to tackling all of these issues. So, for example, if a provider has chosen to implement an outright ban, obviously it would need to consider how that relates to whatever proposal, whatever final options we may choose to take if we choose to implement the condition. But it would ultimately have to explain that in its single document, and students would then know that that policy is in place.
Yeah. Okay, and a question now linked to the register, but a more technical side. So how will the data be stored for the register, and will providers be subject to regulatory action if the data included in a register is leaked or mismanaged?
That's again a good question. I mean, we have specifically not set out any details about what a provider should do with the content of the register. We've said that a provider should ensure that it's shared with the people who need to know in order to ensure that the risk of abuse of power and conflict of interest is addressed. We've said obviously providers should ensure they're compliant with data protection legislation. I think beyond that, it will be a case by case basis depending on the individual context.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Gemma. And like you say, that point about what providers, higher education providers, are subject to in terms of data protection, they'll obviously need to comply with that and protect what is obviously very sensitive information.
Absolutely.
Okay, I think we've got time for one last question. A broader question really. What can I do to get involved in the consultation and to advocate for students in regard to harassment and sexual misconduct?
Do you want me to say?
Yeah, do you want to take that one, Amy? I think that's a good one for you.
It's a good one. Let's end on this note and issue a real call to action for the fantastic numbers of students who've been with us today. Thank you for being here, and I really hope that you can carry the messages away from this session, that we'll be publishing this session and the slides on our website afterwards, so please go and share it with your stakeholders and with your networks. So the first thing you can do is you can communicate and communicate really far and wide with your networks, with your networks across students' unions, with your student union, with your student and with any campaign groups that you're working with, to say that this is happening. You can share all our information. You can share our consultation document. We've also sent out, issued on our social media some videos and student videos and things like that, which would be great for you to share. You can respond to our consultations. That's via, it's quite simple to do. It's via a smart survey. Survey essentially that you can tick boxes and write things in, and we will read and analyze every single one of those. So that's really important. So as well as spreading information, also spread the message that you're all eligible, and it's open to you to fill in that survey. We would love to get hundreds of responses from students. That would be amazing. You can also come along to our student roundtables that are going to be held in April. So if you'd like to sit and talk in more detail with us, if you'd like to use that as an opportunity to tell us your views and tell us all about the various different kind of challenges or the really good things that come about with the impacts of these proposals, then those sessions are open to you. So there'll be details on how to register for those coming up, and we'll advertise them on our social media and our website. And I think it would also be really important for you to go and talk to your universities. Mm-hmm. So if they're not involved already, and if they're not going to do a consultation response, then encourage them to, and ask about what they're doing. What are they doing already? Right, the OFS is proposing banning NDAs or putting these different provisions in for staff-student relationships. Go and find out what your provider is doing, and what distance they'd need to travel if this condition, if these proposals became kind of new regulation.
That's a brilliant call to action. Thank you, Amy. And as well, encourage your student unions to respond as well, or other student representative groups. We're really keen to get a really wide range of views on this. So thank you very much, Amy and Gemma, for your very thoughtful answers, and thank you to all the participants for your questions as well. We've really enjoyed working through them and discussing them today. We do have a slide, there we go, brilliant, which gives our email address. So if you'd like to get in touch with us about this consultation or have any questions, do just drop us an email through that email address. Like we say, the slides are are, I think, already available on the website, and this recording will be put on the website shortly. And a reminder that the deadline to respond to the consultation is the 4th of May. So thank you very much for joining us today, and like I say, for your thoughtful questions. We really look forward to reading your responses to our consultation from you and other students and student representatives. Please do spread the word and share the links with anyone you think might be interested. Thank you for your time and have a good afternoon.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.